There are just 3 airlines that control over 50% of the US domestic market, and they've been around since the early 1900s.
Today, I'm going to take you through the full history of these airlines so you can see just how we got here. Let's get started.
Our story begins in the mid-1920s in the southeast United States, where a boll weevil infestation was ravaging cotton crops. The Department of Agriculture worked with pilots and planes loaned from the Army to test insecticide dusting from the air in Louisiana. They worked directly with an aircraft manufacturer to create the world's very first plane designed just for crop dusting. They also formed their very own subsidiary airline, Huff Dallin Dusters, in March of 1925. This is the airline Delta officially traces its roots back to, making it officially 100 years old.
Now, there was an entomologist who joined the company soon after it was founded.
His name was C.E. Woolman, and a couple years into the company, Woolman had the idea to travel down to Peru during the slow winter season and offer their services there. Following the winter of 1928, he came back to Louisiana and purchased the assets of Huff Dallin Dusters. In December of 1928, he incorporated the new company as Delta Air Service, named after the Mississippi Delta region it served.
This name was actually suggested by a secretary named Catherine Fitzgerald, who would later rise to the executive level within the company.
On June 17, 1929, Delta began flying 5-passenger Travel Air S6000Bs from Dallas, Texas to Jackson, Mississippi, with stops in Shreveport and Monroe, Louisiana. On the other side of the country, William Boeing had made a series of airline acquisitions and formed the company United Aircraft and Transport Corporation in 1929. The oldest of these acquisitions was an airline called Varney Airlines, so United officially traces its roots back to Varney and its founding in 1926.
Now, one really interesting piece of this story is that Walter Varney went on to found another airline that turned into Continental Airlines, so keep that in mind as we go through this story.
In 1930, American Airways was formed from a merger of 82 small airlines, and their first official flights were between New York and Chicago. At this point in time, airmail contracts were absolutely vital to an airline's survival, and Delta really started to feel the pressure in October of 1930 when the post office awarded Delta's most lucrative route to American Airways. This forced Delta to sell off most of their assets and halt passenger service.
But Delta wasn't ready to give up. Really, C.E. Woolman wasn't ready to give up.
He and banker Travis Oliver repurchased all of Delta's assets and reincorporated the company as Delta Air Corporation in December of 1930. Around this same time, United Airlines was really beginning to take shape. On March 28, 1931, United Aircraft and Transport Corporation officially formed United Airlines to manage its growing list of airline subsidiaries. United soon began the very first coast-to-coast passenger and mail service.
Though at this time, it took a brutal 27 hours to fly across the country.
And just before UATC formed United Airlines, they had hired what they claim as the first airline stewardess, a registered nurse named Ellen Church.
So then came the airmail scandal of 1934, which rocked the aviation industry.
President Franklin Roosevelt accused the airlines of collusion and fraud in acquiring their mail contracts. He canceled all of the mail contracts and handed them to the US military, who was not at all prepared for that job. There were a series of crashes and people were not happy, so in the end, Congress passed the Airmail Act, which returned airmail service to the airlines and required that the airlines bid for routes. Another component of this act was that it banned manufacturers from owning airlines, so as a result, UATC was split into 3 completely separate companies. Manufacturing east of the Mississippi River became United Aircraft, the future United Technologies that merged into Raytheon in 2020. Manufacturing west of the Mississippi became Boeing Airplane Company, and the airline operations became United Airlines. For Delta, this was a real turning point because they were able to secure a contract for Mail Route 24, which flew from Charleston, South Carolina to Fort Worth, Texas, with stops in Columbia, Augusta, Atlanta, Birmingham, and Meridian. This service officially began on July 4th, 1934, and passenger service followed on August 5th. At this same time, American Airways was acquired by a man named E.L. Cord in 1934, who rebranded the airline as American Airlines. Cord brought in C.R. Smith to lead the company, and under his leadership, American collaborated with Donald Douglas to introduce the revolutionary DC-3 in 1936.
The DC-3 is one of the most incredible planes in history. It basically showed airlines that they could be profitable with passengers only for the first time ever, which forever changed aviation.
Back at United, they introduced the revolutionary Boeing 247 in 1933. It could fly coast to coast with just 8 stops, eliminating the need for an overnight stop or plane change for the very first time.
You could fly on their signature flight from Newark to San Francisco for $160 one way, which is equivalent to $4,000 today.
American Airlines further expanded its reach by working with New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia to build a brand new airport in the city. This led to the creation of the world's very first airline lounge, the Admirals Club, initially available by invitation only. By the late 1930s, American Airlines had established its signature service, Flight 1 from JFK to LAX and Flight 2 from LAX to JFK. While today's Flights 1 and 2 take just 6 hours, back then they took over 20 hours and required 8 stops, with a plane change in Memphis from a DC-2 to their flagship sleeper DC-3. Delta made some big changes in the early 40s, adding flight attendants to their flights in 1940 and moving their headquarters from Monroe to Atlanta in 1941. They also greatly expanded their service in 1941, including 10 departures from Atlanta a day. Practically every airline in America was involved with the war effort in some way. Delta modified nearly 1,000 planes and trained new pilots and mechanics, while United converted many of their aircraft for wartime purposes while helping transport essential materials and personnel. American Airlines also contributed by converting part of its fleet for military use as well.
After the war ended in 1945, the technological advancements that had come about during the war led to a revolution in commercial aviation.
The introduction of pressurized planes now allowed passengers to travel greater distances in comfort, leading to a surge in demand for air travel across the United States.
Delta was officially renamed Delta Air Lines in 1945. 2 words, don't get it wrong.
Delta went on to purchase Chicago and Southern Airlines in 1953, and following this acquisition, Delta operated under the name Delta CNS for 2 years, and began operating their very first international flights from New Orleans to Caracas via Havana. Additionally, Delta gained access to key domestic routes connecting Chicago and Detroit to Houston and New Orleans. A year later, in 1954, United Airlines introduced the very first flight simulators with visual, sound, and motion elements.
This technology set new safety and training standards for the entire aviation industry.
But it wasn't all good for United during this time, because in the late 1950s, several of United's planes were involved in mid-air collisions. These incidents contributed to the development of the modern air traffic control system we rely on today. Meanwhile, American Airlines stood as the second largest airline in the world throughout the 1950s, trailing only behind the Soviet airline Aeroflot. American also revolutionized the industry by opening the world's first official flight attendant training facility, Stewardess College in Dallas.
By the late 1950s, we were starting to enter the jet age.
In 1958, United Airlines introduced its very first jet, the Douglas DC-8. Just a year later, in 1959, both Delta and American introduced their first jets, Delta opting for the DC-8 and American flying the Boeing 707. This is also the era where luxury started to become an important aspect of air travel. Delta introduced its first airport lounge, the Crown Room in Atlanta, and by 1961 they had added additional Crown Rooms in Miami, Dallas, and Detroit.
These next few decades were absolutely transformative for the aviation industry.
Delta had introduced its now iconic widget logo in the 1950s, but it wasn't until 1962 that Delta applied a consistent livery across its entire fleet. Meanwhile, American Airlines launched Sabre in collaboration with IBM. Sabre was the world's very first electronic reservation system, forever changing how airline tickets were booked. Delta followed suit shortly after, developing their own computerized reservation system called the Delta Map. automatic. Unlike its competitors, it could handle both alphabetic and numerical data without any paper records, significantly speeding up the reservation process.
Also in 1961, United Airlines merged with Capital Airlines, making them the second largest airline in the world, pushing American out of that spot.
This merger introduced United to planes that weren't really flown by other American airlines, like the Vickers Viscount and the Sud Aviation Carvel. Back at Delta, also in 1961, they introduced their first nonstop service between Atlanta and California, strengthening their presence in the West. Delta continued to expand their fleet in the 60s, adding the Convair 880 in 1960 and the DC-9 in 1965.
In 1966, American Airlines approached McDonnell Douglas with the idea of creating a long-range plane that could land on shorter runways.
This directly led to the development of the DC-10, which would become a staple in their fleet for decades to come. In 1967, American introduced a new logo designed by Vignelli Associates, the same team behind the iconic New York City subway signage. This livery would remain a part of American's identity until 2013. By 1970, Delta had officially become an all-jet airline. That same year, they introduced the iconic Boeing 747 into their fleet. And at this same time, 747s were being delivered at United Airlines as well, and they, alongside American Airlines, became the launch customer for the McDonnell Douglas DC-10. Delta was also making their own moves. In 1972, they acquired Northeast Airlines, strengthening their presence in Boston and New York, while gaining new routes to Florida, Canada, the Bahamas, and Bermuda.
United had a very unique moment in history in 1973.
President Richard Nixon became the only president to ever fly commercially in 1973 when he flew aboard a United Airlines DC-10 from Washington Dulles to LAX. Due to the ongoing oil crisis, Nixon had opted for a commercial flight instead of the usual Air Force One, giving the flight the rare designation of Executive One. That same year, American Airlines made history by hiring Bonnie Tiburzi, the first female pilot for a major airline. Meanwhile, in 1974, United Airlines unveiled their new look with their Saul-based designed livery.
Now, we can't talk about the 70s in aviation without talking about the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. Before this, the government pretty much controlled every aspect of the airlines.
The government was in charge of which airlines flew which routes and at which prices. The Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 changed all of that. It allowed airlines to choose their own routes and pricing, and it made it easier for new airlines to enter the market. It opened the skies to competition, forever changing the landscape of commercial aviation in the United States. In 1979, American Airlines relocated its headquarters from New York City to Fort Worth, Texas, setting the stage for future expansion in the South.
The early 1980s marked a pivotal shift in airline marketing.
In 1981, American Airlines introduced the world's first airline loyalty program, AAdvantage, with 2 A's. Just a week later, United responded by launching Mileage Plus. Later that same year, Delta also introduced its own frequent flyer program. This era introduced a new way for airlines to build relationships with their customers.
The airlines were also really expanding their fleets at this time.
In the early 80s, United became the launch customer for the Boeing 767. Speaking of new Boeing planes, in 1982, Delta acquired its first Boeing 737s and welcomed the Boeing 757 and 767 to its fleet. Its first 767, dubbed Project 767, was funded completely by voluntary contributions from employees, retirees, and community partners. In addition, American began implementing a hub and spoke strategy, opening its first hub at Dallas-Fort Worth and soon after at Chicago O'Hare.
Throughout the 1980s, the airlines were rapidly expanding.
In 1984, United became the first airline to serve all 50 states, and American continued to expand its hub network, adding new destinations across Europe and Asia. Delta was making waves of its own, merging with Western Airlines in 1987, solidifying its presence in the Western US and beginning trans-Pacific service from Portland to Tokyo. Then in 1985, United was able to buy Pan Am's entire Pacific division, inheriting their long-haul aircraft and routes. And by 1986, they had 13 Pacific destinations. American was also expanding its domestic operations, opening hubs in San Jose, Raleigh, and Nashville.
The 90s was absolutely huge for these airlines.
It started with American acquiring Eastern Airlines' Central and South American routes, allowing American to make Miami a main hub. They expanded their reach into Latin America throughout the 90s, which has led to them being the dominant carrier in that region. And then came the collapse of one of America's most iconic airlines.
In my opinion.
In 1991, Delta acquired most of Pan Am's transatlantic routes after Pan Am declared bankruptcy. However, United Airlines was able to buy Pan Am's routes to London Heathrow, as well as their remaining Latin American routes and Miami gates. In 1993, United introduced its Battleship Gray livery, which was quite different than United's previous liveries. It also drew criticism for being difficult to see at night. In 1994, American was able to acquire TWA's operations at London Heathrow.
At this point, American and United were the only US airlines operating at London Heathrow.
And it would stay that way until the Open Skies Agreement in 2008. Just a year later, United would become the launch customer for another new Boeing, this time the 777.
One thing I find so interesting is where airlines have had hubs and flights in the past.
Throughout the 90s, Delta maintained a secondary hub in Portland, Oregon, just for its Asia operations. They had flights to Bangkok, Hong Kong, Manila, Nagoya, Seoul, Taipei, and Tokyo.
And just in case you don't know why that is so wild, Portland, Oregon currently has 0 flights to any Asian city on any airline.
Delta was also maintaining their primary hubs in Atlanta, Cincinnati, Dallas, and Salt Lake City at this point. On the other hand, American spent the 90s closing hubs, closing 3 of their hubs that had all been created in the late 80s: Nashville, Raleigh-Durham, and San Jose, California. In 1995, Delta opened the Delta Flight Museum to the public, which is a really cool museum if you like Delta.
And by the late 90s, we started to see a rise in airline alliances.
In 1997, United founded the very first airline alliance, the Star Alliance, alongside Air Canada, Lufthansa, Scandinavian Airlines, and Thai Airways. Alliances allow passengers to seamlessly travel across multiple carriers while also being able to earn and redeem miles. In 1998, Delta and United introduced a marketing partnership between United's Mileage Plus and Delta's frequent flyer program, which had just been renamed to Sky Miles in 1995. You were able to earn miles on both carriers and use both carriers' lounges. This relationship ended in 2003. Then in 1999, American co-founded the One World Alliance with British Airways, Cathay Pacific, Qantas, and Canadian Airlines. And meanwhile, Delta was setting industry records as the very first airline to board over 100 million passengers in a single year in 1997. In the year 2000, Delta formed the third and final major global alliance, the SkyTeam Alliance, alongside Aeromexico, Air France, and Korean Air.
Now, while the 90s was a time of exciting growth, the 2000s were not kind to these airlines.
September 11th, 2001 would change aviation forever. Both American and United were directly affected, as each of them had 2 planes involved in the attack. The aviation industry as a whole was plummeted into crisis as passenger numbers dropped significantly. United had already been struggling following the dot-com bubble burst, which uniquely affected their hub in San Francisco. And American had just purchased TWA in its St. Louis hub just months earlier, so it faced a unique landscape for integrating their new planes and flights. In 2002, United officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, eliminating its Latin American and Miami markets and reducing its fleet by 18%. And then it was Delta's turn. In 2004, the airline laid off nearly 7,000 people in an effort to avoid bankruptcy, which failed. The airline declared bankruptcy in 2005. United made a very controversial decision in 2005, canceling its pension plan in what became the largest pension default in American corporate history. They were able to emerge from bankruptcy in 2006, making it the longest and largest bankruptcy in aviation history. As Delta fought to come back from bankruptcy, US Airways launched a hostile takeover, leading to a passionate Keep Delta, My Delta campaign led by employees and supporters. They were able to avoid a takeover, and in April of 2007, Delta emerged from bankruptcy, celebrating with a new logo and livery. Also in 2007, the Open Skies Agreement was signed. The Open Skies Agreement allowed any airline in the US to fly to any place in the European Union, and vice versa.
As the airline started to stabilize financially, we cruised right into 2008, where nothing financially terrible happened at all, right?
As the 2008 recession began, began, fuel prices soared and demand dropped once again. All three airlines were forced to cut routes, furlough employees, and retire old aircraft. Also in 2008, Delta announced its historic merger with Northwest Airlines, forming the new world's largest airline under the Delta name in 2009. They also acquired Northwest's hubs, including Detroit, Memphis, and Minneapolis-St. Paul. Delta still operates Detroit and Minneapolis as hubs, but closed Memphis in 2013.
Despite the turmoil of the 2000s, they weren't all bad.
The 2000s saw a massive improvement in technology both during the booking and checking in process at the airport and on the planes themselves. Airlines began adding check-in kiosks, gate information systems, virtual check-in, interactive seatback entertainment, Wi-Fi, and more.
Now, while most of aviation history has been about expanding, the late 2000s and early 2010s have really felt like an era of consolidation with some huge mergers happening.
In May 2010, United Airlines and Continental Airlines announced their merger, upping Delta's Northwest merger by creating the world's largest airline. The new carrier would use the United name, but the Continental logo. The two airlines officially became one in 2013. Then in 2011, American's parent company filed for bankruptcy and began the restructuring and cost-cutting process. In 2013, they announced that they would be merging with US Airways, once again creating the world's largest airline. While this new airline kept the American name and branding, the management was taken over by former US Airways executives. American also unveiled a new logo and livery, which remains in use today.
Now, I'm sure we are all aware what happened in early 2020.
The COVID-19 pandemic had a huge effect on all of the airlines. All of them furloughed workers, stored planes, and discontinued flights throughout the early stages of the pandemic. Both Delta and American retired many of their planes, while United was able to keep its entire fleet. American retired over 100 planes, and as a result, they now have the youngest average fleet age of the big three airlines.
Every year since the pandemic has seen an increased demand for air travel, and 2024 was the first time where we were at pre-pandemic levels and even higher in some cases. Let's take a look at how these three airlines stand today.
Delta flies over 900 planes to 325 destinations in 52 countries, and they employ over 100,000 people. American also flies over 900 planes to 350 destinations in 48 countries, and they employ over 130,000 people. And lastly, United flies over 1,000 planes to 342 destinations in 73 countries, and they employ over 100,000 people as well. They currently have the largest fleet size in the US. Today, these three airlines control over 50% of the US domestic market. All three airlines fly to all 6 inhabited continents, meaning you can pretty much fly anywhere in the world on these three airlines.
Happy flying! I'll see you guys next time.